So we got this filters screen where we can set our filters. Now we want to make sure that if this back button is pressed, or also of course if the physical back button on the device might be pressed, we pass those selected filters back to the tabs screen, where we then use them to, in the end, narrow down which meals will be shown if we, for example, select the hamburgers category. Now, therefore, we must find a way of passing those variable values that are managed here in filter start, in the filters screen state, back to the tabs screen. And for that, of course, we need to find a way of knowing when the user tapped the back button, the physical one or the one in the top left corner. And this is another common requirement, and therefore Flutter helps you with that. It gives you a special widget, which you can use here in your scaffold to wrap it around your body. And therefore that's what I'll do. I'll wrap a widget around my column here. And the widget I will wrap around it is the will pop scope widget. Will pop scope is a utility widget that, as you can see, essentially wraps the entire content of this screen here. And will pop scope allows you, and actually wants you, to set a on will pop parameter. And on will pop actually wants a function that returns a future. And you might recall I mentioned futures earlier. Futures are these objects which eventually resolve to other values which are not there yet. So a function that returns such a future. And that function will be invoked by Flutter whenever the user tries to leave this screen. So here we can pass a function, and this function receives no arguments. But in this function here, we can now manually call navigator of context pop. And the advantage of doing so is that pop actually allows us to pass some data along with it. Some data which will then be available in the place where we navigated to this screen, so to the filters screen. Well, and that place is our tabs screen. There, it's in this set screen method where we, in the end, navigate to the filters screen. So therefore, it will be here where we will get access to the data returned with help of pop from inside this filters screen. Now here you can return any kind of data. And what I will return here will be a map where I want to have different keys for my different filters, and then true or false depending on whether that filter has been set or not. Now for that, to standardize those keys, I'll actually add a enum in this filter start file at the very top of the file, which I'll name filter. And here I'll add some unique identifiers for all these filters that we can set. So here I'll go for gluten-free, lactose-free, vegetarian, and vegan. So that we have these clearly defined keys, and these should be my keys in this map which I want to return. So my map here, which I'm returning in pop, will have those different enum values as keys. So filter.glutenfree as a key, for example. And then as a value, separated by a colon as you learned, the currently stored value for that filter, which for this gluten-free filter would be stored in this underscore gluten-free filter set variable. So that's the value I want to set here. And I'll now repeat this for all my other filters here. So for lactose-free, for vegetarian, and for vegan, like this. And therefore, this map here will be in the end what will be returned by this filters screen when it's popped, so when the back button is pressed. And we will then be able to access this data, this map here, from inside the tabs screen, because that is where we navigated to this filters screen. Now we're not entirely done yet, though. Instead here, in this will pop scope widget, in this function here, we have to return true or false to in the end confirm whether we want to navigate back or not. And since we are navigating back manually here, we should indeed return false so that we're not popping twice. If you would not be popping manually here, but doing anything else, like saving data to some database, it would make sense to return true instead. If you wanted to allow the user to leave the screen, here we'll return false, since we already have our leave screen logic here, and we don't want to pop twice, because that would essentially mean that we would probably close our app. So here we return false, but here we pop manually, essentially leaving the screen with this data being passed back. And now we just have to keep in mind that onWillPop actually wants a function that returns a future, which eventually yields a Boolean, instead of getting a Boolean right away. And therefore, to make sure that this is the case, we should add the async keyword here between this empty parameter list and the opening curly brace. Because by adding async here, you can not only use the await keyword, as you learned before in this course, but instead you will also automatically wrap the value returned here into such a future. So that's a convenient way of creating a future that will be returned by your function. So by adding async here, this function will return a future that will then eventually resolve to this false value. And with that, we have control over this going back process, and we pop manually with our data. Now we just need to read that data in that place where we navigated to the filters screen.